Well, thank you for being interested in this topic. This is a really important topic, looking at how we bridge marketing and finance. And I'm going to give about 10 minutes of presentation, and then we're going to have a really good discussion with a phenomenal team. And the first thing I want to say is that if you are feeling a lot of pressure from those in your organization to demonstrate marketing's impact on financial income, you are not alone. You're at the right place for this meeting. The reality is that this is the #1 challenge faced by marketers, reported in a survey not too long ago. And interestingly, when you dig deeper in, 65% of those marketers reported that they do not have a team that's integrated with marketing and finance working really closely together. And in this particular survey, 50% of CMOs said that they face pressure from non-marketing people to focus on short-term results. And how many of you feel that out there? And what's interesting is that number has gone up from when that survey was taken to the most recent survey. That's now over 65%. And with increasing financial pressure probably on the horizon, that number will go up even further. When we looked at marketers specifically, what was interesting was that 63% said that the measurement systems that they have only measure the short-term effects of marketing. And 67% said that they do not have an LTV measure, that either they don't have one at all or they don't have one that is aligned with marketing and finance. Interestingly, when we followed up the question and said, what is your LTV to CAC ratio, which is a very common thing that CFOs learn when they are in school, getting their CPAs and so forth, 87% of marketers couldn't answer that question. Now, this has been a very long journey for me. It has been a 30-year journey. When I first saw digital data, I thought we were going to solve this problem a lot faster, because I'm like, okay, finally, we have the data that we need to answer the questions about what is marketing's return on investment. This is great. Wired wrote a cover story on it in 1998, some of the advances in the work we were doing. I've written a few books on the topic and so forth. But it turned out to be a lot harder, more because there are cultural differences and so many of the different things that marketing has as an organization create a good enough solution out there that we weren't motivated enough to really figure out how we took all this new data and new information and connected in a way with finance. So, you go through the list of things that we have in marketing at our disposal. We've got randomized controlled tests and marketing mix models and brand tracking and brand lift and multi-touch attribution and lifetime value modeling, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the issue is that those are important for individual use cases, but it's time for us to start to figure out how we integrate those together. We need to learn how to integrate them together, because if we are going to connect with marketers and finance in one integrated fashion to take on challenges like changing budgets or a changing environment that becomes unpredictable every single day, that close relationship is important. So the reality is that you can think of CFOs from Mars and CMOs from Venus, and we have different love languages. And because of that, we sometimes have some conflict. Last year, I presented a story about Lou Pascalis at Bank of America and how he lost a $100 million advertising budget to carpeting in the branches at the moment when you needed advertising more than ever because they were trying to shift people to mobile banking. I mean, it was crazy, but the reality was that that marketing organization had not developed really good ROI explanations and stories and data to tell their story of how they were going to have a bigger impact on the business, and the operations division did. So the key thing that I have learned in this process of connecting with CFOs is that their world grows up from the individual transactions. They have 400 years of accounting where they can take the individual transactions into the general ledger. They have different schedules that they run that all tie back. They can be audited all the way back down to the individual transactions. And that is what they feel comfortable. It's what they trust. It's what they know. And so when marketing comes in here with this top-down marketing mix model that has a bunch of assumptions built into it, or a brand tracking study that's an overall survey that's trended, and we don't have those individual transactions all the way down to the individual person building up, there's skepticism. So part of what we've been looking at is how do we overcome that skepticism? Part of it's a language issue. Norm de Greve, the CMO at General Motors and the chair of MMA Global, he doesn't use the word branding and customer experience when he's talking to his finance counterparts. Instead, he uses the term maximum multi-year returns, which means the same thing, but who doesn't want maximum multi-year returns, right? And if you do it right, you can actually connect the idea of branding and customer experience to the maximum multi-year returns that you can achieve by doing things like what we're doing with the BAPS studies at MMA Global with some of the different members, like Ally Bank, for example, did one of these studies. And what they could see is that when they focused on branding and brand equity development, it didn't have as big of a return immediately in the first 2 months, but over the 2-year span, it absolutely outperformed what the short-term efforts are. And you're going to feel the pressure to focus on those short-term results as the economy gets more difficult, perhaps. And I want you to keep this chart in mind, and I want you to keep in mind that we are very close to the solution that will help you connect the dots and bring that information together. It has been a 2-year journey working with a lot of different brands, doing a lot of different types of studies, and engaging with the different teams and looking at whether or not we could solve this. And if you're asking the question, is it possible? The answer is yes, it is possible to solve this. We have determined that there are 7 core ingredients to connecting the dots. We have written the draft white paper, which shows the recipe of how to combine the ingredients. And we will share that with you if you'd like to engage with us and engage with your finance and marketing teams. We believe that the prep time from the time, if you have the ingredients in-house, and a lot of you will, it's about a 6-month prep time from when you say go to when you have the results that you can begin to share with finance and see if you can get on the same page and engaged on that longer-term return. Now, our goal is to make this generally acceptable in the industry, a standard that we can all use and buy into, the same way that finance has generally accepted accounting principles or GAAP accounting. And so if you're interested in engaging with this, the sneak peek of what this looks like is these charts here. These are the 7, the core ingredients. And you'll notice that the 7th ingredient at the bottom is AI decisioning. We've had some great studies. You just heard from Cadillac and some of the work that Claritas and MMA have done to measure AI personalization. We are building this for a future where we know that AI will be highly involved in the decisioning. And it becomes all the more important that we have brand equity and measures that look at short-term and long-term impact so that we can show that in an integrated fashion. Now, it also is important that you have an identity graph and multi-touch attribution and randomized control tests and econometric modeling and lifetime modeling and advanced brand equity linking, connecting those two. And when you put those together, you can do something really powerful. This is an initial sneak peek, and then we'll get on with the panel. What you can do is you can look at your profile of how your marketing is influencing your brand equity, how much revenue it's generating, how much profit it's generating, and a finance person can take that and calculate what type of impact it has on their stock price, which is something that they care very much about. Now, what you can also do is you can see what happens when you begin to change your profile. Like if you move that slider bar towards that short-term ROI because maybe you need to make this quarter's number or this month's number, what happens to your business? And we can now see that numbers and those data playing through, and we can see how that begins to bend that curve to where you do get 10 million in incremental upside right now in the short term, and that's good, but that trade-off cost you 65 million over that 2-year span of time. Now that becomes a really powerful conversation when finance is bought into the way that brand equity is connected to sales results and seeing that type of an impact. Now, another way that you might visualize this for the finance folks is that when you look at your current enterprise value and they say, hey, we need to cut back marketing, sure, you get to take that dollar to the bottom line immediately, and there's some benefit from that, but it costs you in the longer term because you're going to then have fewer sales and ultimately less profit in the longer term, and that will cost you more. It's sort of like shutting down a factory. Yes, you get to take the savings right now, but if you're not building something and producing something, what are you going to sell a year from now or 2 years from now? That's true in marketing too. You are the factory of the mind, creating demand, and our ability to connect that data together and show that impact, that can be a powerful part of the conversation. So with that, I would like to bring up our panelists and bring up Priyanka and Sean to have a discussion about what they're seeing in their business. Thank you.
Hey, Rex.
Thank you for joining us. Great
Happy
discussion.
to be here. Yeah.
So Sean is CFO, Priyanka is CMO. They work very closely together, and at Vox, they were one of the brands that we really described as, when we looked at the maturity model, from not working with finance at all, which is 65% of marketers, to working really well together. We described you as in the prime of your life, like perfect part of the maturity model. And I want to hear a little bit from you. Was it always like this, or did you guys have to work on the relationship? How did you guys get to where you have marketing and finance literally every single week looking at the same numbers together, the numbers that marketing's building, and building your financial plans on that? Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So first, I want to thank Rex for this process. We spent around 6 months, I think, with Rex doing some work for Project Romy, which Rex was talking about. I actually thought it was a great process. If anybody here is interested in trying to find ways to improve your dialogue with your finance team if you're in marketing, I think it's a good way to talk about finding common language, finding out what the business values, and making sure you're aligned in terms of what's important. But to answer your question, so when I started at Vox Media 3 years ago, the consumer marketing budget was essentially a fixed cost. It was a dollar amount that was pretty static, that was spent to the dollar exactly, and the only reporting that I saw was how many paid acquisitions that it got. So this actually set a lot of red flags to me because, as a CFO, one of the primary questions that I have to ask about everything, whether it's a hire or putting in carpeting or marketing is like, what's the return for something that you spend? When you have somebody that's spending a large amount of money and they're not actually asking to spend more because they believe what they're doing is valuable and they can drive more overall value for the company, for me it was confusing. And digging in, it was pretty clear that the reason that they were so hesitant was there's a lot of unknowns and a lot of questions that would come out of any kind of a justification for extra spend. Priyanka started shortly after I did, and she came in, and the very first thing she did, which actually earned a lot of trust from me, was pretty much pause all the marketing spending because she had a lot of questions. She wasn't sure that what they were doing was right, that we're spending in the right areas, getting the right consumers to be on our subscriptions. And she wanted to ask questions and really get an understanding of what was happening. And as a CFO, like for me, that was really important. She showed she valued our money, wanted to spend it wisely, and wanted to figure out what was the right way to make marketing not a fixed cost, but something that was actually dynamic and could drive value. And I think the very first thing that her team got working on was this LTV model, which really didn't exist in any kind of sophisticated form beforehand. And for me, that was really the key question, which is if you're spending money to acquire an asset today, which is a subscriber, what is that worth? And how much can you spend based on that estimate of value? And that process, which she worked on for the first couple months, revealed there's a lot of unknowns, there's a lot of messy data, lack of historical data, highlighted what needed to be better instrumented, improvements that had to be made on the stack. And ultimately, her team built a great model, and the finance team uses the marketing team's model for our revenue projections. We have the ability to change some assumptions, which we can get into, make things more conservative, but the actual model we agree with, we think it's the right model. It's very complex, well thought out, and we're not going to replicate it. And I think a lot of that is because the process she went through gave me the trust and transparency that she was actually building something that was a real model versus a justification for marketing spend.
Right on, Priyanka. Tell me more about what you had to do when we joined and build on that story.
Absolutely. I think the most important thing that we started with was aligning on a shared set of metrics that we were going to measure spend against. I think the biggest thing is if we were ever going to scale up our budgets, we needed finance's trust, and we had to be speaking the same language. So determining those metrics were important, and really also being very transparent about how much of our spend would be towards direct, quicker ROI spend versus longer-term brand equity and brand building spend, and setting the right expectations for both of those allocations. So that was really critical, and having this shared model, I will say, was very stressful at first. It felt like there was a lot of scrutiny on our budget, which the team wasn't used to, but in the long run, I think we've ended each year spending more than our initial budget because of it, and scaling up in times of efficiency or when we find new opportunities or audience investments that we want to make, so that's been really positive.
Yeah, there's definitely a need for trust, and you guys built a good sense of trust, because I had the chance to go through your models to look at the different detail, and I mean, literally, you have weekly numbers that he's able to see if it's paying off or not. I mean, it's really pretty impressive what you've accomplished together. And one thing that I noticed when I was talking with Sean, though, about what he does to take that same model and those same numbers up to the board is he applies a few discounts here and there. And I'm curious, I understand you're building the official board plan, and so you are truly taking marketing's information in a really granular, rich way. Compared to what I've seen in other organizations that I would not define as mature, they get some marketing input, but they basically take the overall, like, what's your budget, what's your spend, where you guys really have the mechanics of how marketing is creating that value. Mm-hmm. That's the big difference that these two should be applauded for. But tell me a little bit about why you feel like you need to build a safety margin in if marketing has a good plan. What makes you nervous?
Sure, so I think everyone here probably knows this, but as a CFO, your role is to be conservative. You have to be risk averse, you have to be cautious. Marketing generally is on the other end of the philosophical spectrum. They're optimistic, they want to do more, they believe that they're going to achieve these goals. So finding the middle ground, which is a board plan, is a really important kind of conversation between marketing and finance. And I think from my perspective, and I think most CFOs would agree, when you think about what's risky and what's uncertain, anything short term is much more quantifiable and knowable, and there's a lot less risk. When you start talking about long-term things, and LTV is the prime example of that, because that's usually a multi-year value creation number, that's where there's a lot of future behavior that affects that number. You know, what's going to happen next year with retention, what's going to happen with a whole host of things that could affect what the LTV is. And so that longer-term value like that becomes more speculative. And so when I look at the model and think about what we're going to use as a revenue forecast, what I generally like to do is put in padding on anything that's long-term, because it's going to be more speculative. And then, you know, on the short-term stuff, there's going to be some sort of discount or some sort of hedging put in just to make sure that we have padding to beat the board plan, but that's generally not touched as much. And so just from a practical matter, when we think about LTV for our consumer subscription business, and it's a number of our properties, so New York Magazine is the largest, but also Vox, as well as The Verge, all have subscription offerings. We take the LTV, and it might actually be a 4.5-year type LTV for a customer in terms of someone that signs up now, there's a 4.5-year lifetime value for a cohort. We're not going to take that full 4.5 years, so we'll discount it and cap it at, say, 2 years or 2.5 years. So we're cutting off, you know, anywhere from 30 to 40% of that LTV value and using a much lower LTV. But from a finance perspective and spending perspective, that's a much safer number. If we actually hit the original forecast LTV, there's kind of a 20%, 30% annual return baked in, which is the return you want to see when you're investing money up front. And worst case scenario, we'd break even if we hit that kind of reduced number. And that gives you the comfort to spend close to the LTV with a CAC and not have to worry about being underwater. And what you don't want to be in is a position where you spend a lot of money today that a year or year and a half later it turns out was a waste because something had changed radically in consumer behavior or retention where that LTV is way off. And so the biggest thing that I do is hedge the LTV and try to cap it in terms of what we feel is the value of a user, at least from a marketing target standpoint. And then the other thing we do is we look at CAC, and we usually assume higher CAC than is in actuality or in the plan historically. And that's just another hedge where we are assuming that CAC will go up. And that's generally one where the marketing team has done a great job of beating that, but it gives us protection short term, as well as making sure that we're not destroying value long term by using an LTV that's way off.
So I told you in my earlier part of the presentation that CFOs speak a different language. You just heard that, and I'll do a little translation. LTV to CAC is cost of acquisition, and the idea in general is that if you take all the marketing fully loaded cost of acquisition, you basically should be able to get 3 times that in LTV or higher, and if you are, you're sort of in that golden area where you will get more money. So that's a good thing. So, but thank you for speaking the language and helping us understand this. This next question is for Priyanka, and speaking of building on LTV, you guys built a great LTV model. I was able to look at that. You have it by channel, and you even see when people come in, how they adjust and so forth. It is a brilliant acquisition LTV-oriented model that you guys have docked on and connected with. But one of the things I noticed was that there wasn't a whole lot of marketing spending once you had acquired that customer. Again, a lot of that probably is in your owned and operated, and maybe you don't have to pay for it. but it seems like there's an opportunity to bend the LTV curve. So if you're thinking about it as marketing, your goal is to get more customers, but man, if you can retain them, the impact it has on your business can be really phenomenal. Can you tell me a little bit about how you're starting to think about, maybe bending the LTV curve and getting Sean to pay for that and fund that, and how that works?
We're getting close. So retention is one of our most important metrics as a consumer revenue business, and that's largely because it's actually more cost efficient to retain a customer than acquire a new one. I think the challenge has been that sometimes it's harder to measure that impact, or it takes longer because you might not be impacting a renewal cycle that's 12 months from now if you have an annual subscriber, for instance. So I think what's really helped is building out these really robust LTV cohort models where we can show finance that if we can improve renewal rates by even just 5 to 10%, that has a huge impact to the bottom line. And that might not be today or in a month, but in 6 to 12 months, you really see that impact, and that's gotten finance a lot more comfortable with investment in marketing. So we have started to ramp up marketing investment against retention and win-back efforts. The other great thing is we have a lot more data about current subscribers and churned customers, so we can use that data to launch very targeted and personalized campaigns, which have been really effective. An example is we can show a piece of content to a user based on their past reading behavior, or we've done a lot more marketing around our app because we know that even though when you download our app, there's no instant monetary value, an app user over a period of time has much higher engagement than a non-app user. Or for win-back, it's about presenting the right offer to the right user in addition to some personalized recommendations to remind them about the value of the product and subscription. So all of those things have been effective. We're still working to get more sophisticated in how to incorporate those into our models because, again, it takes a lot longer to understand what the impact will be, but using leading indicators like increasing engagement or increasing frequency has helped us do some projection of the increase in retention rate.
Yeah, and I think that that's really important, that what you did, which is setting up those cohorts so that you can begin to track it over time. Because while it initially takes a long time, because you have to let time play out and see what happens with their curve, you can then later on go back and analyze, was there a leading indicator that told us in the first few weeks of them trying something new that they were going to be different and more valuable?
Exactly.
And then you can begin to sell against that kind of leading indicator. So you're totally on the right journey. I'm excited to hear that's making good progress. Okay, so this question is going to be a harder one. I'll start with you, Priyanka. In our conversations, again, you totally nailed acquisition. You're making progress on retention. But branding was really discounted, and we know that that's one of the hardest things to potentially measure. What's your thought on how you might begin to think about the brand equity component and whether or not, again, that's something that you could define its value and, again, get Sean to buy into that this is going to make us a more valuable company?
Yeah. Brand equity is a very important part of our marketing strategy, and I do believe it's critical for future and sustainable growth. What we've done pretty recently is incorporated our marketing funnel into our financial model. So we're tracking how our audience in consideration is changing over time and ensuring that that is remaining healthy. If you start at the bottom of the funnel, I think we've put a lot of investment in optimizing our conversion rate against high intent users, and that is at a very good place now. But in order to keep that efficiency over time, we need to replenish our top and mid-funnel audience. And so having that as something that we've tracked, I think has given a lot more tangible benefit to brand marketing and brand equity spend. I will say the other thing is we know that investment in brand equity will increase LTV because it increases user intent. It should increase the renewal cycle, but what it also does is bring up your CAC. And because Sean is very focused on LTV to CAC, I think an important conversation to have with your finance team is, what is the optimal LTV to CAC to drive future growth? You can have a very optimized LTV to CAC, but you'll max out on the number of customers you can acquire at that CAC, and that will impact revenue and profit 12, 24, 36 months from now. So I think understanding what the optimal ratio is, not based on what you're able to achieve today, but based on revenue and profit in the future, is really important.
I'm trying to read Sean's face and seeing if we're making him nervous, talking about underwriting brand equity that's a longer-term impact and potentially raising CAC to have these good synergistic effects. How are you feeling right now? Are we making you nervous? And how do you think as a CFO when you hear
So it doesn't make me nervous, but I'd say, the natural response is there's always a bit of skepticism when you're talking about money that's being spent and you can't measure directly any short-term impact, right? So the question is, how much should you be doing? What % of your total marketing budget should be on brand activities? And if you're doing them, there must be some way to measure them long-term, right? There should be some impact that's felt, whether that's in keeping the CACs at the same level as you scale your marketing, retention, a whole bunch of other things, just being able to address more consumers that you can trace, come down the funnel later. And I think Priyanka's done a really good job of building, I think, a lot of the work in terms of proving that we need to do more brand building activities and brand marketing by incorporating upper funnel metrics into the models and into our thinking. And I think the key thing for me and for any CFO is how much can you prove the linkage and over what time frame? And I think there's a lot of investment that we're starting to do that I think is really important for everyone to think about for their businesses. Because I'll say that I totally believe that all these upper funnel and brand building investments are absolutely needed to scale. I think metrics like brand favorability, NPS, brand awareness, consideration, all that stuff are really important. You can see that if you take off the gas for those, there will be an impact at some point for your lower funnel metrics, and CAC will go up, and you'll tap out for addressable users or consumers that you can convert over. The question always is just what's the optimal amount of spend, and what's the right way to do it, and how does that really tie into a long-term model, and how much you have to invest today for next year, et cetera. And I think starting that conversation, tracking the metrics, tracking whatever you can is really important to building that linkage. And I think on the other side of our house for Vox Media, because we have an advertising sales business for our media brands, and it's primarily brand marketing focused, it's an integral part of every single campaign we do to provide this kind of reporting on these upper funnel metrics, including NPS and awareness, consideration, and a whole host of other things depending on who the customer is. We think that's absolutely essential. It's up to the customer to really take that data and tie it into their models and prove the benefits, but we think about optimizing against those for every campaign we do, and I think it's the right approach. And like I said, this is where the art comes in, because there's arguments for a lot today. There's also arguments to optimize and have smaller amounts, and cash is a consideration too, and EBITDA for most companies and how much you want to spend today. But finding that right balance is something that probably is difficult to do unless you have a real dialogue early on with finance and agree on what the metrics are and be able to start to track and lay the groundwork to track the return over multiple years.
Well, we hope to have more data and models that will connect it to where you can have more confidence in details. We got just a little bit of time left, so I'll ask the last question, which is, when you look back, is there anything that you would have done differently, or what comes next in your integration journey with marketing and finance working closely together as a partnership?
Yeah, I think for me, what went well when Priyanka joined was building trust and transparency. And I can't stress the transparency, which is admit what you don't know, don't hide mistakes, be very open about what is an unknown or is a risk area, work to instrument and measure and remove those areas. All that stuff is, I think, very aligned with what finance wants to see. And I think investments in marketing stack and measurement and tracking, which are expensive, all are worth it in the context of really building a more robust model and giving more confidence in terms of the money that you're spending and the return on it. So I think all that's good. I think the other thing that we did a pretty good job on early was just getting shared language and terminology. We talked about LTV and CAC, but those can mean very different things in the marketing organization than in the finance organization, just because of what the definition is. There isn't a standard definition for those two terms even within the organization. And so by having one model and locking in kind of what that is, it gave us kind of shared definitions and terminology for some key metrics. And I think that's incredibly important. And I think a lot of the disconnect that happens is marketing has its own set of language and words that usually is not understood or doesn't really apply to finance. And The classic one that I always see is ROAS, which 100% ROAS sounds great, but in reality, you're at best kind of getting your money back when you look at it, because that means you get $100 back for $100 spent. And since there's cost of revenue, usually you're losing money at $100 ROAS, 100% ROAS. So when we think about return in finance, it's return on investment, which is the net profit over it, which is more like 150 or 200% ROAS. And I think that kind of disconnect where there's terms that are used by marketing that don't really make sense to finance tends to kind of snowball and cause problems later on, and why I think trust can start to erode or people start to ignore what marketing is saying and just focus on very short-term results because they just don't understand or trust the metrics that they're seeing.
Great. Well, I know we're at time, but I just want you to give these guys a hand because it can be done, marketing and finance, Mars and Venus together. So thank you.
Thank you, Rex.